Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome for tuning into the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast. No trucks here, GSMC, Golden State Media Concepts. This has nothing to do with trucks, this is not GMC. I am your host, Josh Hadley, and right now, things are a little bit weird in the sci-fi world. I don't think anyone will debate that. Things are really strange with the whole lockdown thing, everyone walking around like they're a Mortal Kombat ninja, and they have this... Honestly, what it feels like is everyone is inside a sci-fi movie right now. You've seen so many of these, not just outbreak movies, but all of these other weird movies where there's a pandemic or a zombie outbreak. Isn't that what it feels like right now, or is it just me? Like, when I go to the store, I feel like Katana from Mortal Kombat is shopping right next to me. That's just me, anyway. So, what we're going to be talking about tonight, in the final segment, I'm going to be talking about some TV shows, some sci-fi TV shows you probably don't even remember. I'm going to give you like a top 10 of what I consider really, really good sci-fi TV that have kind of gotten lost in the static, as it will. You know, these are things that maybe aren't on streaming, maybe aren't even on DVD, maybe these are things you just gotta find elsewhere. But for the first thing I want to talk about, we're losing all of the people who built science fiction. I mean, I'm not talking about the Harlan Ellisons and the Isaac Asimovs and people like that for the print science fiction, but just this week, Ted Newsom passed. You might not know Ted Newsom's name, but Ted Newsom, I knew the man personally. He was a friend of mine. He worked for Canon back in the 1980s, and one of the things that Ted did was wrote, among other things, the Spider-Man movie that never got made, the one Canon was going to make in 1986, that Tobe Hooper was going to direct, and then it never happened, and then parts of it got turned into other things, and all of that nonsense. And a lot of his Spider-Man script from Canon turned into the Sam Raimi, David Koepp Spider-Man in 2001. So you did see a lot of his Spider-Man in that. And at the same time, he made lots of documentaries, he made lots of direct-to-video films, he wrote a lot of great content that you have probably seen before. And he just died over the 4th of July weekend. And what hit me hard was I had just talked to the man a couple of weeks earlier. As I said, I knew him in real life. And I had just talked to him, and then I found out a couple of days after the 4th of July that he had passed over the weekend. And I was like, damn it. And not only did that hit me personally, because it was hard to deal with, because I've had more than one of these. A couple of people that I knew who were screenwriters or people like that just all of a sudden die, like Bill Margold, who, you know, he used to be an actor in adult films, and then now he's passed, obviously, but he became like a historian and a podcaster and a writer he was a film critic. He loved grindhouse films. And I remember a few years ago when he died on the air of his show. He had a heart attack on the air, and I'd known Bill for years. It seems like we are really, really starting to lose all of these people that built everything that we as science fiction fans, as horror fans, as fantasy fans, as genre fans, everything that it was built on. We're losing these people. We don't have George Romero anymore. We don't have Tobe Hooper anymore. John Carpenter is hopefully going to hang on for a while, but he's going to be going soon. We're losing all of the old guard. And I think that's a shame, especially when it's someone like Ted Newsom, who you might not know his name, but you absolutely have seen things he worked on. And that is the real problem with all this. So, mourn Ted Newsom, but also celebrate it. Go and watch his hilarious movie, The Naked Monster. It's not a porno, despite what the title might indicate. It's actually a Zucker Brothers style airplane spoof of 50s monster movies with Brink Stevens and Linnea Quigley and Bob Burns and people like that in it. It's got a lot of people like Kenneth Tobey from the original Thing from Another World. He's in it, kinda playing his same character. Sylvia Van Buren from the original War of the Worlds is in it, kinda playing the same character. Like I said, it's a hilarious satire of monster movies. I believe it's on Amazon Prime right now, and it's called The Naked Monster. And if you don't like it, I would be shocked, because it is shockingly funny, I think. And you hopefully will think that as well. And like I said, I'm going to be talking about television shows later on, but right now I also kind of want to talk about what is going on with this whole wanting something you can't have. Because the whole thing here is, I keep seeing over and over and over again, oh man, Firefly might come back. Oh, Amazon looks like it might pick up Firefly, blah, 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 blah. Oh, Firefly might come back, Firefly. Every couple of years. Okay, Firefly was in 2004. And then, of course, you had Serenity a few years later. The problem with this is, no one watched it in 2004. Most of you people, I remember watching it then, and because I was a critic for some magazines at the time, I actually had the original pilot. So I know they didn't air the pilot till the 8th episode when it actually aired on TV. I saw the pilot first, so I wasn't as shocked when the 2nd episode was the first one that they aired, because Fox is apparently made of geniuses. But when Firefly aired in 2004, nobody watched it. But now it's got this giant audience. All right, fine. Now, I enjoyed Firefly despite my massive distaste for Joss Whedon and just about everything else he's touched. I did like Firefly, and I thought Serenity was fantastic. And Serenity was also a fantastic send-off. And that's where the problem comes in here. It's over. Okay? Even if this was not some pipe dream, even if Firefly were to come back, even if Netflix or Amazon or whatever would pick Firefly up and make a new season, it would absolutely not be the same show that you watched in 2004, or that aired in 2004 and you watched later on DVD. It wouldn't be the same show. The actors have all moved on. The production has moved on. The way it was shot has moved on. It wouldn't fit in 2020. And there are so many examples of this, of a show being brought back after years and years and years. The X-Files is a perfect example. The X-Files was the 90s. It tapped into something in the 90s zeitgeist that was very 90s. And you could even tell that when the X-Files was still on the air, that once those episodes, those post-2001, those post-9/11 episodes, they really just felt off at that point. And that was kind of the problem. That's what you're going to get with Firefly. Because remember when in 2018, 2016, whenever the X-Files came back a few years ago, it literally didn't feel the same. I mean, it felt the same, and it also felt like it was a relic of the 1990s. And that is part of the problem here. Firefly is a relic of the early 2000s. It won't work now. And also, just leaving aside the fact that it's a pure pipe dream, okay? Firefly will never come back. Stop pining for it. It's not going to happen. It's the same thing I see this with Farscape. People keep talking about, oh, Farscape's going to come back. Every year or two there's an announcement. Hey, we're in discussions to make a Farscape web series or something like that. It's never going to happen. Okay? And even if it does, it won't be any good because it won't be the same show you left. These whole bringing a show back after a big long hiatus has never worked. I can't think of a single time where this has worked, and yet people just pine after this. They pine after it, and I just don't get it. So stop with this Firefly is coming back. Just let it die. Let it be the 13 episodes and the movie. Okay, you've got a few comic books. Fine. Just let it go. That's the point of this. Let it go. We have to, in a way, one of the big things in science fiction right now is we love the past too much. And I'm not saying that everything in the past was great, and I'm not saying everything present or that's coming in the future is going to be bad. But they're different things. Like, you can't have, we'll talk more about this in the next segment, you can't have a modern RoboCop that's going to feel like RoboCop anymore. RoboCop was an 80s, 90s concept. That's why the RoboCop remake failed. You can't bring this stuff back. This whole, what we'll be talking about in the next segment is this whole 25, 30 year later sequel thing. It doesn't work. There's a reason things die. There's a reason things fade. Whether it is the market changing, whether it is people changing, whether it is tastes changing, everything matters in this. And it's almost impossible to recapture that magic. Like the Blair Witch 3 or whatever you want to call it. I think they called it The Blair Witch. That was trying so hard to be the Blair Witch Project, the one from 1999. And it failed because it's not 1999 anymore. The Blair Witch doesn't work anymore. You have to really innovate. I mean, the Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows was a really great sequel. I think it's the best film in that entire franchise. And yeah, you can attack me and throw your spears and your flaming torches at me all you want. But I think Blair Witch 2 is a fantastic movie, and more people need to stop overlooking that film just because, it's a sequel. Shut up. But that's the point. Firefly can't come back. Farscape can't come back. I think Max Headroom, which I'll be talking about in segment 4, is one of the greatest, most innovative, most ahead of its time TV shows ever made. But it wouldn't work today. Every now and then you hear some rumblings about, we want to bring Max Headroom back. Max Headroom would work perfectly in the digital age. No, it wouldn't. Max Headroom was an 80s concept that was almost the 80s boiled down to its very core. And that is where it needs to stay. Max Headroom wouldn't have worked in the 90s, and it absolutely will not work today. And that's the same way. There's just something about fandom that they can't let this stuff go. And that's what I have a problem with. You have to both move on and fondly remember. There's nothing wrong with going back and watching your Firefly DVDs and enjoying them and immersing yourself in that world. But you're not going to get new adventures. You shouldn't get new adventures. It was what it was at the time. And you kind of come across as pathetic when you keep going, well, we want new, we want this, we want this. In a way, it's even like the Picard series. The Picard series is trying so hard to not be Star Trek that it comes across as just like false edgy, like, Picard, it's got nudity and swearing and graphic violence. Oh, you're so edgy, I almost cut myself. That's what Firefly would be like if it came back today. It would have that Game of Thrones influence all over it. And that's not what it is. That's not what it should be. So the way I look at it is, let it go. Let the past die. And I don't mean in a Last Jedi sort of way. That was actually just taking out beating Star Wars fans, urinating on their faces and telling them how much they would like it. No. Rian Johnson is a piece of garbage, and so is The Last Jedi. That's not what I'm talking about by letting the past die. You don't forget the past. You don't bury the past. You don't burn the past. But it has to exist in the past. And this whole constant, let's bring this back, let's go for a remake, let's do this again, let's do this again, let's do this again. Oh, maybe it's time for a reboot of this. No, it's not. They're trying to remake Miami Vice right now. Vin Diesel wants to bring back Miami Vice. And you say, why? Miami Vice, almost like Max Headroom, was the 80s personified. Miami Vice won't work today, and that crappy Michael Mann movie proved it. It will not work today. Let it die. That's the lesson you need to take away from this. So in the next segment, I'll be talking about something tangentially related to this, the 30-year plus sequel. And again, why these don't work and the sort of hubris that's involved in these things. So right now, we're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back. So enjoy the commercial.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
So the 30-year sequel, and I'm just rounding, it's obviously not 30 all the way around, but you have like right now as I'm recording this, Disney is saying, hey, maybe it's time that we make another Tron sequel. Cause yeah, Tron Legacy was so damn good. Tron Legacy, here's the thing. Tron didn't work in 1983. I think it's a fantastic movie, but it didn't work for audiences. It didn't work for critics. That was a movie that I think was too far ahead of its time. And the problem with that is they spent so much money. That's why, other than a crappy cartoon in the 2000s, Tron Legacy was the first attempt to really do anything with the Tron franchise after that, other than some video games, but it's based on a video game anyway, so that sort of makes sense. The thing with Tron Legacy was, just like what I was talking about in the previous segment, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit at all. And that's the problem with it. It doesn't fit today. It came across as a 90-minute long Daft Punk music video, which is essentially what it was. Because it didn't follow the tenets of what Tron was. Because Tron was 1983. Tron Legacy was the 2000s. And everything had changed so much. And they also added so much ridiculousness that it made you start to question it. Now, you shouldn't have to nitpick every single detail of, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense because of this. You shouldn't have to do that. But when you watch Tron Legacy, they were almost begging you to. So everything in Tron Legacy is coded, right? It's all in a video game. So it's not like chickens just exist. Chickens are coded. So when they're eating this dinner, so somebody coded in a cooked chicken, or did they code in a chicken that then somebody caught and they had to be coded in on how to cook the chicken, but then they had to code in how to taste the chicken, and there's none of this makes any sense when you think about it. But the movie added so many ridiculous elements, you couldn't help but think about it. That was the problem here. And you're getting this again and again, like we've got Bill and Ted Face the Music. Again, you're way too late for this. Bill and Ted 3 should have been made in the 90s, because Bill and Ted is also a very 90s franchise. And based on the trailer for Bill and Ted Face the Music, it looks like it's going to be a lot of navel gazing, a lot of fart sniffing, a lot of, oh my God, remember this from the previous movies? Oh my God, remember this 90s thing? Oh my God, look how old Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves are. It's the same thing with Ghostbusters Afterlife. Now, I personally think Ghostbusters Afterlife, and I'm only basing it on the trailer, obviously, it doesn't look too bad. Obviously they waited way too long. They should have made Ghostbusters 3 back in the early 2000s or the late 90s when Ivan Reitman and Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis were trying to do it. And you had the whole cast there. You didn't have Amy Pascal interfering with the horrible Girlbusters remake thing. Ghostbusters 3 should have been made then. Now you have a lot of hurdles you have to get over. Now you have to deal with Harold Ramis's death. Now you have to deal with the fact that Bill Murray is so prickly now that getting him for any kind of real screen time is going to be a chore. That is the problem that you're facing here. And there's also the fact that now, after the Girlbusters remake, you have to leap over that hurdle. You have to get over just how awful that movie was. Girlbusters was one of the worst films I've ever seen. And I want to be on record. It's not because they were girls, because that was done in Extreme Ghostbusters very well. It was done in the Ghostbusters TV show, The Real Ghostbusters, very well. There were female Ghostbusters all the way back then. I have no problem with those. Those were done well. Why? Because they were well written. The Girlbusters remake, on the other hand, wow, were these just bad. It was so poorly written. It was so poorly acted. There was absolutely zero humor in this. I mean zero. There was no humor in this movie. And the problem that Afterlife now has to deal with, being so far after Ghostbusters 2, is now they have to not only regain the audience, they have to be true to the original film, true to the ideals of the original film, and leap over the awfulness that was Girlbusters. And that is a lot to have to deal with. And that's why sometimes the 30-year sequel, it just waits too long. And sometimes was anybody really asking for this? Like the whole Maverick, Top Gun 2, who was really, really demanding that Tom Cruise come back to the role of Maverick? Other than being a vanity project, who was asking for this? Or at least who is asking for it now? Because they were asking for it back in the late 80s. They were asking for it. Now nobody wants this. And that's the same thing with something like Dr. Sleep. Okay, I'm not a fan of The Shining. I'm not a fan of Kubrick, but I understand why people like The Shining. I personally do not. And no, I don't like Stephen King's version any better. I think both versions are very bad. I've read the book. I just never thought this was that great of a show, or this great of a movie. But the thing with this is, nobody really demanded a sequel to this. We didn't need to know what happened to Danny. The Shining was pretty much a self-contained story. There was no reason to continue it. None at all. And Dr. Sleep was beyond disappointing because it felt like it was a no-win situation. And that's what you get sometimes with the 30-year sequel. You get into a no-win situation where if you pay too much homage and have too many references to the original, then it comes across as pandering and pointless, and it can't stand on its own. But if you ignore the original too much and make it too independent, well, then it's not really a sequel anymore, is it? So it's sort of a no-win situation. And that's the problem a movie like Dr. Sleep fell into. There were some good ideas in it, I honestly didn't think that this movie needed, for one, it didn't need to be as long as it was. Jesus Christ, was this too long. But the movie, it didn't do what it needed to do. I was never like, oh, what about other people with The Shining? And yes, first of all, I know that's in Stephen King's other novels. It's in The Dark Tower and all that kind of stuff. But this whole Danny being traumatized, and I didn't care. The whole thing with the Shining vampires, that was kind of neat. I thought that should have been just its own movie. It didn't need to be a Shining sequel, per se, with Danny and going back to the Overlook and all that. That should have just been its own thing, I believe. So, a movie like Dr. Sleep, it just doesn't work for me. It came across as, why now? What said now is where you want to make Dr. Sleep? Same thing with Blade Runner 2049. First of all, I absolutely hated the movie. I love Blade Runner, and I think 2049 looks amazing. I will not take that away from Denis Villeneuve at all. That movie looks amazing. It is a visual masterpiece, but it's also self-indulgent, overlong, trite, poorly written, and pandering to its audience, and to Blade Runner, the original movie. I just did not like 2049, but it also begged the question, why now? Why 30 years later? Why 30 years later are you finally making a Blade Runner sequel when Warner Brothers have been wanting to make one in the late 80s? Now again, I don't think there should have been a sequel. I don't think Blade Runner needs a sequel. But if you were going to make it, that's when it needed to be made. It didn't need to be made last year. It didn't need to be made today. And it especially didn't need to be made the way it was. It's overlong, as I said, self-indulgent, but also with a lot of these 30-year sequels, you also run into the aspect of we're setting up a franchise, because everything nowadays has to be a franchise. And I know a sequel by definition is a franchise. I absolutely get that. But Blade Runner 2049 was setting up future movies. It would be setting up Blade Runner 2050 and Blade Runner 2055. And that's what you get in a lot of these. Dr. Sleep had little things where it's like, oh, we can get more movies out of this. We can get more movies. I'm sure Bill and Ted Face the Music is not going to be the last one. I'm sure they're going to leave little openings where they can go, hey, look at this. We're making a Bill and Ted 4. Oh, look at this. We're making this. You know, like Coming to America. Okay. I used to love Coming to America. I know it's not sci-fi, but whatever. I used to love Coming to America. And my girlfriend recently bought the DVD and we watched it. And this is the first time I've seen it in 25 years. Wow, does this movie not hold up? The humor doesn't hold up. The acting doesn't hold up. The message doesn't hold up. And now they're making a sequel. Or I should say they made a sequel. I don't know how much the pandemic and COVID screwed up the post-production of it, but I do know that they've at least finished principal photography on it before everything was shut down. And that's the problem. Who's really asking for this movie? Who's asking for Coming to America 2? Besides Eddie Murphy, being self-indulgent. Because I know it's a movie he wanted to make. Because one of the things, and this is the problem like I brought up with RoboCop. When you remade RoboCop in 2014, who were you making that movie for? You were definitely not making it for fans of the original 80s and 90s movies. And it seemed like you weren't making it for fans who grew up on those, or maybe were not fans, because I heard this whole argument that, oh, the RoboCop remake, it's not for you, it's not for adults, it's not for people over 30. This is the new generation, the modern generation's version of RoboCop. But it wasn't. It was trying to do both. It was trying to dance on that line of we're both nostalgic and new and original. And that never works. Ever. And I mean that ever. I've never seen that work where you're both nostalgic and original at the same time. Again, that is a problem here. So what you have to look at is this 30-year sequel. Why? Because you have to ask the question, 1, who's it made for? 2, Why are you making it now? Why didn't you make this back then? And I'm sure that can also fall into, well, we were trying to make it in 1999, but the script just wasn't there, this just wasn't working, etc., etc. At the same time, you have to ask, what do you think a modern audience is going to get out of this? Because especially when you're doing a 30-year sequel, you have to look at the aspect that why, not who, but why will people be interested in this? Will they be interested in it because it's a sequel to a movie that came out 30 years ago? Or is it, oh, I remember that. Oh, wow, I remember seeing RoboCop in the theater. I'd love to see a new one today. And that's not even bringing up the fact that a lot of these 30-year sequels, especially if there's other entries in the franchise, have to deal with the nonsense that is, oh, hey, look, this is a sequel only to the first movie. RoboCop 2 and 3 didn't happen, like the RoboCop Prime Directives miniseries in 2000 tried to do, where it said, oh, okay, RoboCop 3, RoboCop 2, and the TV series didn't happen. This is a sequel only to the first movie. And then you turn into the nonsense that is the Universal Soldier franchise, where there are 3 Universal Soldier number 2s, each one saying the other Universal Soldier number 2 doesn't count. You get into this whole cluster of just nonsense when you do that. So ask yourself as a listener, what does the 30-year sequel mean to you? And especially if you're not even old enough to remember the original movie. That's the big part. Are you even old enough to remember the original film that Coming to America? How many people even remember that movie who were not alive when that movie came out? Same thing with Dr. Sleep. Most people who went into Dr. Sleep based on the reviews, they'd heard about The Shining. They hadn't seen it. Same thing with Blade Runner 2049. They'd heard about Blade Runner. They knew about this movie, but they didn't know what this movie was. And that's the big problem here. So I'm going to be talking about some TV shows in a little bit. But right now, we're going to take a quick break, and we will be back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So what we talked about earlier was the loss of people, the loss of our people. We talked about the whole 30-year sequel thing. We talked about bringing it back, Firefly and etc. So the question is, what is with the wave of nostalgia? Why are modern TV shows, shows that are currently, and I'm going to say on the air, you know what I mean. When I say on the air, can be Amazon, stuff like that. Why shows that are on the air today, why are they not looked at the same way you look at Firefly, like a show like The Expanse, for instance, which in a way is kind of like modern Firefly, kind of with some Game of Thrones graphicness and gore added into it. But a show like The Expanse, maybe in 10, 15 years, it'll be looked at the way you look at Firefly with these rose-colored glasses of, oh my God, this was the perfect show. Oh my God, I love the dialogue. I love the characters. Does there need to be a distance? Does there need to be a divide in there? I think that's the question we have to ask is, why is a show like Firefly so fondly remembered today when no one watched it in 2004? Will The Expanse be remembered the same way? Will a show like Continuum, will that be remembered the same way? Because, I mean, like, let's take Star Trek, for example. Now, I'm older, so I remember Star Trek was before my time, the original series, but I remember watching those in syndication. I remember watching those all throughout my youth, 5 days a week. And then Next Generation came on when I was still in middle school, and I watched that. And then Deep Space Nine when I was in high school, and then I was already married and had a kid by the time Voyager had come out. And, I just gave up on Enterprise because that was garbage. And then who knew that Discovery and Picard would actually be worse than Enterprise, and that Enterprise wouldn't end up being the worst thing that ever had the Star Trek name put on it. But I do remember when I watch old classic Trek, when I watch a perfect example, Star Trek The Next Generation's pilot, Encounter at Farpoint, when that first aired September 27th, 1987. I remember watching that, and I was so excited for it. And the now me, the film critic me, the critical me, the 40-something me, looks back at Encounter at Farpoint and says, oh my God, is this bad? It is so poorly written, so poorly paced. It is ridiculously padded. This is a terrible, awful episode and a terrible way to start a new Star Trek. At the same time, I sat and watched that. I pick out that part of my brain, the synapses that remember September 27th, 1987. And I say, but you remember how much you loved it, how much you absolutely were enthralled, sitting on the floor, watching this with your dad. You had no idea what was coming. You had no idea what this new Star Trek was. And that's actually what we called it back then. We didn't call it Star Trek The Next Generation. I have old VHS tapes of off-airs that just say The New Star Trek, because that's what we called it then. It was just The New Star Trek. And as much as people might complain about Star Trek The Next Generation's first season, and it's a pretty bad first season until you get to the very end with Conspiracy and Neutral Zone, as much as people might complain about that, what you've got to realize is you're complaining about it with the knowledge of what came later, with the knowledge of how much better Next Generation got, how much better Deep Space Nine got, how much better the whole Star Trek franchise got until Enterprise pooped its pants, and then we just kept getting worse from there. But when you take that first season on its own merits, it was like classic Star Trek just again in 1987, 1988. It felt like classic Star Trek, the kind of fake sets with the fake backgrounds, the way the stories were told. It's only when you look back at it that you go, these were really, really bad. Although at the time, when we were watching these brand new week after week, they didn't feel like that. And that's the thing you got to wonder about, say, Firefly, say, The Expanse, anything like that. Most of us didn't watch Firefly in 2004. I did, but again, with it being aired out of order, it was a mess, and the DVDs put them in the correct order. So you have to wonder, if you're a Firefly fan, and you did watch the show in 2004, with the episodes being out of order, with the continuity being all over the place, are you loving Firefly because you watched it back then? Or are you loving it for what it was meant to be, but wasn't back then? So you have to kind of look at it from that angle. And I think you're not, because a nostalgia is always going to play into how we look at, especially science fiction, because while dramas might age, especially like cop shows and the way they deal with race or drugs or hippies and stuff like that, those will age badly. But science fiction, in theory, should not age poorly. It should, because science fiction should be a future thinking, a future gazing. It should be a way you look at the future. And that, if it's done properly, should not be rooted to a specific point in time. Although obviously it's rooted to a specific point in how you look at it. Like if you look at Escape from New York, that's a very 1981 version of, well, what 1997 might look like. Max Headroom takes place in 2016. It's a very 1986 version of what 2016 might look like. So I'm not saying they're timeless like that, but when you watch Firefly, how are you watching Firefly? Are you watching it through the eyes of 2020, or are you watching it from the eyes of 2004? And that's what you got to look at with this whole, do I want this back? Again, I'm going to go to the X-Files. The X-Files just, I don't know if it was intentional, if Chris Carter was onto something, but when you look at the X-Files, and I watched it from the pilot on, I watched it all first run, that tapped into something in the 1990s, because you had the growing technology, you had computers and the internet were these new things, you had all of this distrust of the government, you had conspiracies were not as debunked as they are now and not as insane. And then when you brought it back, it just absolutely didn't work because none of that was true anymore. Or it could be, in the case of the X-Files, it became too true. Because by the time the X-Files came back, Donald Trump was in office. And you had actual conspiracies, and you had him conspiring with Russia, and you had people like Alex Jones now at the forefront. People like Fox Mulder in the 90s were seen as just kind of harmless kooks. And then by the time the show came back, people like Fox Mulder were dangerous provocateurs who were really hurting people and hurting the economy and hurting actual truth in journalism. So things had changed. The X-Files didn't fit anymore. That's why Farscape didn't really deal with politics at all, but Farscape just doesn't work anymore. Farscape is so early 2000s, late 90s era sci-fi channel. It doesn't work today. It wouldn't work today. And I think the Peacekeeper Wars, to a degree, while I think it was a fine send-off to Farscape, I also think it bungled it somewhat. It kind of slipped and broke its ankle, I think, because there were things where you can tell, okay, this is bringing it back after a couple of years of hiatus, and now we're rethinking it. It's sort of like with this thing with the Snyder Cut, the Justice League Snyder Cut. Everyone's, the Snyder Cut. Oh my God, we're finally going to get to see the movie that we didn't get back then. No, you're not. You're going to get the movie Snyder would make in 2020. You're not going to get the Justice League movie that didn't come out then. It's not like they're just releasing an already finished cut. He's now going back and changing it, and I want to add this and I want to add that. You're not getting the Snyder Cut. You're getting a new version of Justice League. You're not getting the original version of Justice League. And that's the problem here. So many people look at these bringing things back as a way to just kind of pick up where you left off. That's not how this works. You don't just pick up where you left off. You pick up from the new sensibilities. It's like I brought up Escape from New York. John Carpenter has said on most of his early movies, Escape from New York, Assault on Precinct 13, movies like that in the 90s when he made this comment, he said he wouldn't make them the same way today, that he's grown as a filmmaker. And that's the point. If he would make Assault on Precinct 13 in 1997, it wouldn't be the Assault on Precinct 13 that we love. And I think Escape from LA is proof of that. Because Escape from LA is 90s John Carpenter basically trying to remake Escape from New York. And look at the quality difference between those two. Escape from New York's a classic. Escape from LA is and that's also another, not quite 30 years, but a way late sequel that didn't really need to be made. And that's the problem. This whole looking back, it's fine to have nostalgia. But Twin Peaks The Return is the perfect example of why you can't get it back. Twin Peaks The Return feels like cynical, mean-spirited Twin Peaks. It doesn't feel like Twin Peaks. Even Fire Walk with Me, as graphic as that got because it was a movie, still felt like Twin Peaks. It still felt like it fit into Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks The Return, on the other hand, feels like hate sex, like angry sex towards the original. It feels like bitter, angry David Lynch was like, "Oh, you people want a sequel to Twin Peaks? All right, I'll give you a sequel to Twin Peaks. Here's your sequel to Twin Peaks." And it's bitter, it's angry. And I think that's what you would get with Firefly, because Joss Whedon is not the same guy, leaving all the sex abuse allegations aside. He's not the same writer that he was in 2004. That's the problem. People are thinking it's still 2004 Joss Whedon, though. So stop navel-gazing. Stop looking at the past with rose-colored glasses. Accept Firefly for what it is. 13 episodes and a movie from early 2000s Fox. Don't bring it back. Stop trying to have something you can't have. Go to The Expanse. Look at The Expanse. That's a show that maybe you'll really, really like. Watch Black Mirror. I mean, I know that's an anthology series, but check out Black Mirror. I mean, I think the last couple of seasons have been kind of garbage, but Black Mirror's got a lot of good episodes in it. Look for shows like that. Look for some of the weirder things. And maybe I'm contradicting myself because I'm about to, in the next segment, talk about 10 TV shows that you probably don't even remember, that you should remember. And to do that, I have to look back through the past, don't I? So this will be a nice, interesting look, I hope, at some shows maybe you didn't even know existed, maybe shows that you've heard of. And I've got way more than 10. I could turn this into multiple episodes of doing top 10 lists of great sci-fi TV that is just, it's out there, but it's not. Maybe you gotta look for it on YouTube. Maybe you gotta go to some of the sketchier parts of the interwebs to find it. But we're gonna be looking at that after the break. But right now, I want to say, take your time and decide what you actually want in a TV show. Do you want something that is just pandering to you, or do you want something that is truly good on its own? Because that's the question you have to ask yourself. Was Firefly good on its own, or is Firefly being looked at through nostalgia glasses, nostalgia goggles? Same thing with the X-Files. I think a lot of 90s X-Files episodes hold up. A lot of them really don't. And it's kind of the same thing with Star Trek The Next Generation. Watch that first season again through the eyes of not knowing what's going to come later. And look at it as the new Star Trek, as we called it back then. The new Star Trek. And I think you will hate those season 1 Next Generation episodes a lot less when you do that. So we'll be back, and I'll give you some TV shows you don't even remember.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
So, all right, for the final segment, now TV is a very fickle, prickly thing. TV shows come, they go, boom, gone. There are so many instances of a TV show that maybe was so far ahead of its time, but it only lasted 3 episodes. And it's totally forgotten. It wasn't played in syndication. There's absolutely no market to put it on DVD. It's not on maybe any of the streaming services. So here's a look at some of these. Like, a couple of years ago, SciFi Channel had this one called Blood Drive. And it was basically, what if Death Race 2000 was a TV show, but very satirical? I mean, Death Race 2000 was satirical as a movie, but you get my point. Where Blood Drive, it aired on the SciFi Channel. It's extremely graphic. They had to black box and beep out a lot of stuff. Every episode was basically a grindhouse thing. Every episode was a different grindhouse genre. And it's a shockingly overlooked series. I had to import the Australian DVD set because it's not available anywhere in America to stream. But you can still find the episodes out there, and I think you should. Just like in, I think it was 2003, Threshold. This was a show that It had its head up its ass a little bit in the fact that it expected too much out of its audience. This came right after Lost, and Lost hit, and then every network wanted their own Lost. NBC had Surface, and CBS had Threshold. And Threshold, I can't even describe what the plot is because it would take this entire segment to describe the plot, but Threshold is an alien invasion that's not an alien invasion show, that is a lot more subtle than an alien invasion show should be. Had a fantastic cast, had pre-Game of Thrones, Peter Dinklage, you had Carla Gugino, Charles Dutton, Brent Spiner from Star Trek The Next Generation was one of the main characters. You had great guest actors like Jeffrey Donovan from Burn Notice, pre-Burn Notice obviously. Threshold is a show you should check out. It is available on DVD. And then Showtime had the interesting Odyssey 5. Where it was a time travel alien show that wasn't. Basically, 6 astronauts on the space shuttle are up there when Earth accidentally explodes. Oops, that happens. So an alien is able to download their consciousness into their bodies of 5 years ago so they can try and figure out why Earth exploded. And it was really interesting, took a lot of twists and turns. Peter Weller stars in it, but it was canceled on a season 1 cliffhanger, and it was never picked up again, and nobody talks about Odyssey 5, but it was a fantastic show. Then you have stuff like Baywatch Nights. I know, before you kill me, what is a Baywatch show doing on this? But trust me, Baywatch Nights Season 2 was the X-Files. Season 1 of Baywatch Nights was just a low-grade detective show. You can just leave that aside. Season 2, on the other hand, somebody decided the X-Files are super, super popular right now. So you've got Mitch Buchanan, lifeguard, and part-time private eye fighting aliens and vampires, hunting werewolves, fighting a reanimated mummy, a time-traveling Viking, stopping an alien spore from spreading across the earth, infiltrating the Illuminati. I wish I were kidding. Baywatch Nights Season 2 absolutely qualifies as a sci-fi show and should be seen because of just how insane it all was. You need to see Baywatch Nights, especially Season 2. Then there is Total Recall 2070, which it sounds like it's a spin-off of the 1990 Total Recall movie, doesn't it? It's not. For one thing, it ignores all of that movie, but it's really Blade Runner the series. And I'm not being facetious when I say that. It's Blade Runner the series. Because They couldn't get the rights to do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep or Blade Runner, but Showtime was able to get the rights to Total Recall. But this whole show is about the Recall Corporation making androids and the police unit that's hunting them. So it's Total Recall, but it's really Blade Runner with a Total Recall sheen. Lasted 1 season, very high production values, really great show you really should check out. I brought up Max Headroom earlier, and I'm specifically referring to what's called the Action Series, the 1986 ABC show, because there's also the Max Headroom video show and the Max Headroom talk show. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about with Edison Carter and all of the action stuff. This show was so far ahead of its time, we are still catching up to Max Headroom. Max Headroom is the first real cyberpunk television show. And I think that's what makes it really stand out. It's just amazing production value. The writing is so fantastic. The acting is above board. Max Headroom is the greatest sci-fi TV show of all time. I literally have an original poster of it hanging on my wall right as I'm recording this. You have to check out Max Headroom. It is available on DVD. Now, this next one, this isn't technically a series. It was always meant to be a mini-series. It's a 5-hour mini-series called Wild Palms. It's sort of, what if Max Headroom and Twin Peaks had a baby? Now, that is selling it short because Bruce Wagner, the creator of it, he had this as a comic book long before that. But it's Oliver Stone and Catherine Bigelow and William Gibson and people like that making this show about holographic TV and Scientology. It's kind of a Scientology thing. Very well produced, extremely high production values. Wild Palms is a trip, man. You can get the DVDs. They're a little expensive because I think they're but you can get the DVDs for Wild Palms. Then there's Charlie Jade. This might be the most obscure one I'm ever going to talk about. It's a Canadian South African TV show that is the most pure science fiction show I've ever seen. The last 5 episodes, the last 5 hours, are some of the best sci-fi TV I've ever seen. The show aired briefly on the Sci-Fi Channel, but they didn't finish it. You have to import the DVDs. I think Charlie Jade might be available on Amazon Prime, but I don't have Amazon right now. Charlie Jade, I could literally spend the next hour explaining the plot, and I would only get through the pilot episode. Because the show is so complex. It's like a novel for television. This is not a show where you can skip an episode and not be completely 100% lost in it. A throwaway line of dialogue in episode 5 might be a major plot point in episode 13. It's one of those, but it is fantastic. I cannot recommend Charlie Jade any higher. Then there's something like Morgan and Wong, them moving off from the X-Files and Millennium when they did Space Above and Beyond. Well, actually, they hadn't done Millennium yet, but Space Above and Beyond. It's a military space show about an alien, technically an alien invasion, but we're the invaders. It's kind of complicated, but the entire show is told through the eyes of the grunts. And that's the unique angle of it. It's told through the grunts' eyes. We as viewers don't get information the main characters don't have. So we don't know about the machinations that might be happening off camera or a secret peace treaty or a traitor or something. We only get that information when the grunts on the ground run into it. So it's a really interesting take on an alien invasion and a military show. And with Morgan and Wong involved, you get a lot of fantastic dialogue and character interactions. And then there is Chris Carter. I guess when the X-Files was not getting stale, but was super hot, he decided to adapt, and I put the word adapt in quotes, the comic book Harsh Realm, which only lasted 3 episodes. There were 8 or 9 shot, but they're all on the DVD, but only 3 episodes aired, and it's really interesting. It doesn't quite follow through on its premise, but there are some really good ideas in it, some fantastic performances. I do recommend Harsh Realm. You can get the DVDs, but I don't know how difficult those are. I can almost guarantee that's not on a streaming service anywhere. But those are 10 weird sci-fi shows you should check out. And as I said, I've got hundreds more I could talk about. It's absolutely insane how many great sci-fi TV shows no one remembers. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. If not, well, I'm sorry, but we will look at more maybe next week. But I want to thank you all for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd also like to ask you to remember to subscribe to the show and write a review, whether it's nice or not. It really, really helps us. And then follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And have a good night. Keep one foot in the gutter, one fist in the gold.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.